Have you ever had trouble falling asleep at night and find yourself in the dark, in the silence, pondering some pretty profound questions? Is there life after death? Is there a heaven, a hell? And if there are, which is my final destination? These questions are hardly new, and no one can definitely answer them. These are matters not of facts, but faith. And still there may be value in asking ourselves one additional question. How did people of the past avoid obsessing about these issues? 400 years ago, the people we now call the Pilgrims wrestled with all this, and the answer they came up with, well, actually more of a spiritual practice than an answer, was a way of living and believing that freed them from worry and granted them peace. It was a practice that set them apart from most of the Reformed Christian believers of their time, and it's an approach to believing that's worthy of attention today. To understand how the Pilgrims came up with their solution, we have to go back to the early 17th century, to Holland, where these questions about one's fate in the afterlife were the hottest topics of the day. At that time, Christianity was still experiencing the aftershocks of the Reformation, the religious reform movement that swept through Europe in the 1500s. Reformers had believed the Roman Catholic Church was corrupt and off course, and broke away to form a new branch of Christianity, Protestantism. And by the early 1600s, Holland was the heart of the newest Protestant thinking. But there was a big problem. With Protestantism, in the effort to correct all the perceived faults of Catholicism, the so-called Reformed Christians often disagreed about what the true tenets of Christian belief should be. And one of the major sticking points was the issue of who would end up going to heaven and who was going to hell. The prevailing belief was that no human on earth could know where they were headed. Only God knew that. And further, for each one of us, God has known whether we were saved or damned even before we were born. Reformed Christians believed this because to them, there was no limit to God's power and knowledge. This doctrine was called by a big word. The theologians were well acquainted with it, but the lay people probably were not. Predestination. It was a daunting tenet of the new Protestant faith. The fate of your immortal soul was already written in stone by God, and there was nothing you could do about it. Nothing. But there was a vocal minority of Protestants who disagreed. They followed the teachings of a Dutch theologian and university professor named Jacob Arminius. Arminius taught that our fate in the afterlife is not entirely in God's hands, that there is a shred of the possibility of human free will in this critical matter. He believed we all have a slim chance to control our own destiny by convincing God through our actions that we're worthy of salvation. This idea wasn't new. It was first put forward back in the 5th century by a British monk named Pelagius, who was denounced as a heretic, not only by the Pope, but also by St. Augustine, regarded as antiquity's greatest Christian philosopher. As you can imagine, this counter-doctrine, called Arminianism, set off a firestorm. And this firestorm raged in the city of Leiden, where Arminius taught it to his university students, and where the Pilgrims were then living. They'd been there for the past decade, seeking refuge after being persecuted in England. Everyone in Holland was debating the issue. It was so heated that there was violence in the streets. So the Protestant leaders decided to hold a conference a conference that would decide once and for all which doctrine would become the accepted view of the Dutch church. The year was 1618. In the history books, it's called the Synod of Dort. Cutting to the chase, the Arminian view was overwhelmingly rejected. God was acknowledged as the absolute sovereign of our fate in the afterlife. We had no say in the matter. The idea of predestination not only prevailed at the Synod of Dort, but morphed into the single most crucial tenet for Reformed churches after 1619. It was the primary focus in the private lives of most Reformed Christians. They now had to wonder, am I among God's elect, the ones who will join him in heaven, or am I among the damned, doomed to spend eternity suffering in hell? No 17th century Christians took the church's new emphasis on predestination more seriously than a group in England you've no doubt heard of, the Puritans. Not the Pilgrims, the Puritans. They're not the same. Even though over the past 400 years, we've made the mistake of lumping them together in the popular imagination. So before continuing, let's take a minute to make the difference between them clear. First, the Puritans. The Puritans were a group that got their name because they made it their mission to purify England's Protestant Anglican church. They had a long laundry list of things they didn't like about it and wanted to change it for the better. They believed that the church's worship services were too elaborate and ceremonial, too much like it was before the Reformation, when every English man, woman, and child was Catholic. They didn't like how praying during worship followed a scripted formula, instead of allowing the minister and his congregation to pray as they pleased. And they didn't like that the king and his bishops controlled the church. They yearned for a simpler national church, more like what they believed the Bible said it should be. So who were the Pilgrims? They were a minority of reformers within the ranks of the Puritans. They came to realize that purifying the church was not the answer. They believed that England's church had strayed so far from Christ's teaching that they had to break away and form their own church. The Pilgrims were rogue reformers who split off from the Puritans to become Christian free agents. Only by doing that could they be free to pursue their own separate vision of what they believed to be the true Christian faith. Back in the 17th century, no one called them the Pilgrims. That's a name we would attach to them later. In their own time, they were known as separatists because they had separated from the Anglican Church. A whole new chapter of the story of the Pilgrims and the Puritans was added when both groups came to America. The Pilgrims came here first, landing in Plymouth in 1620 aboard the Mayflower. Almost a year after they arrived, they celebrated a harvest feast with at least 95 men from the Pokanoket tribe and other nearby Wampanoag communities, an event that we remember as the first Thanksgiving. The Puritans arrived almost 10 years later in 1630, a lot of them, more than 1,000 Puritans in several fleets of ships, and they settled farther north in New England. Within a decade, the population of their colony grew to over 20,000, outnumbering Plymouth 10-1. The big event we remember them for is the Salem witchcraft trials. And that's the shorthand history of the distinction between two groups of people that over the centuries have been largely misidentified as one. And understanding that distinction is the only way for us to make sense of what happens next in the story we're telling now. As I said, when the Synod of Dort in 1618 established the doctrine of predestination as Christianity's focal point, the solemn and sober Puritans took the matter very much to heart, and then some. The question of who would be saved and who would be damned became an obsession. A key reason for this obsession was that in England, the Puritans, as rebels within the Anglican Church, had to live below the Church's radar for their own safety. They had to live in a closet, a theological closet. They weren't able to talk to their neighbors about their spiritual views for fear of being exposed and punished, maybe even put to death as a heretic. This meant that their faith was always turned inward. They could torture themselves with introspection. Am I too sinful to be saved? What's the use of behaving holy if I'm already damned? The Puritans were afflicted by this paralyzing introspection even after they came to America and could worship safely in churches filled only with other Puritans. But by that time, for many, it was deeply embedded in their worldview. The moment of truth for every Puritan in New England came when he or she requested to become a member of the church. In order to qualify, you had to demonstrate you were worthy of the honor. Only those strongly assured of their salvation, the saved, the elect, could join the flock. Each prospective member would appear before the church elders and make what was called a confession or profession of faith. And the elders would ask the most penetrating of questions, scrutinizing the farthest reaches of the candidate's soul. The next element of this public profession involved declaring before the entire congregation that you had undergone an experience of God's grace. In other words, before the whole church, you were testifying that God had given you unmistakable signs that he had predestined you to be among the elect, that you were assured, as you could possibly be, that you had been saved and would spend eternity in heaven. Then the candidate was subject to penetrating questions by both the church's elders and its members. As an example, we have the written profession of a 17th century maidservant in Boston. We know only her first name, Catherine. She describes the whole process of how God had made her aware that she had been totally destroyed by her sense of sinfulness. She compares her suffering to a variety of biblical figures who had experienced the same sort of misery. And she tells how she had then been awakened to the knowledge that God, in his mercy, had elected to save her. The elders and the congregation, in this case, accepted Catherine's account and welcomed her into the church. But many others weren't so fortunate. Sometimes the elders and the congregation weren't convinced that a candidate truly had this experience of grace and rejected them. The candidate then had to live with the perpetual doubt about their fate in the afterlife. But then again, all of the pilgrims had some degree of doubt about where they stood before God because they accepted that only God knew for sure. For some, living with this doubt was too much to bear and drove them to a breaking point. A Puritan woman in Boston snapped and grabbed her infant child and threw it down a well to drown it. One written account specifies that she then came into her house and announced, now she was sure to be damned. But she soon learned that her horrific attempt at murder failed, as others in the town came to her child's rescue, so her doubts presumably continued. The pilgrims took a very different path. They believed in the haunting specter of predestination just as much as the Puritans, but avoided making it their obsession. The hallmark of their faith was not fear, but hope. It's vital to understand how they managed that, because the solution they devised is timeless. What worked for them 400 years ago can still work for Christian believers today. One key thing to remember about the Pilgrims is the year they formed their separatist church, 1606. That's 12 years before the Synod of Dort made its ruling about predestination and placed such a huge emphasis on the doctrine. This gave the Pilgrims plenty of time to iron out the tenets of their brand of Christianity, including how to deal with the daunting baggage of predestination. The Synod's ruling did not impact the Pilgrims like it did the Puritans, because they'd already come to terms with the issue in their own unique way. Knowing that, it's ironic to remember that in 1618, when the Synod of Dort was convened in Holland, the Pilgrims had been living nearby in Leiden, where the teachings of Jacob Arminius had stirred up the whole inflammatory issue of predestination in the first place. In 1620, after staying in Leiden for 12 years, the Pilgrims sought greater religious freedom in America and made their renowned voyage aboard the Mayflower. The Pilgrims' pastor and spiritual leader was a man of wisdom and forbearance named John Robinson. He would never make his way to New England, but he, more than any other, shaped the Pilgrims' religious beliefs and worldview. Robinson's study of the Bible concerning predestination steered him to a conclusion that escaped the Puritans. He taught the Pilgrims not to obsess over whether you were saved or damned. There was no point in dwelling on that. Instead, he told them, and I'm quoting, "We believe both promises and threatenings, both rewards and punishments, in the order set by God, but hope only for the things desirable." Robinson's message to the Pilgrims was to live with the hope of assurance that they would receive the gift of eternal life in heaven as promised in the Bible. Think and believe positively and live the godliest life possible. Be comfortable with uncertainty. Live not in fear, but hope. This viewpoint was reflected in the process of sharing your confession of faith in order to become a member of the Pilgrim Church. Compared to the Puritans' version, it was night and day. All a candidate had to do to qualify for church membership was live an apparently godly life and profess an understanding of Holy Scripture and the faith's tenets. That was all. One Pilgrim Church member, Robert Cushman, expressed this sentiment with great eloquence. "Of the heart, only God must be the judge. If the profession be sound and the conversation honest, in the outward appearance and manifestation, we have naught to do to examine any further, but only in charity to judge men to be such as they outwardly appear, leaving secret things to God." Cushman hit the nail on the head. If there is a God, only He knows our deepest secrets. And if the doctrine of predestination is valid, God holds the biggest secret of them all from each of us, our fate in the hereafter. But if that's something that too often is a source of worry and sometimes keeps you up at night, you can ponder how the Pilgrims coped with the problem and just maybe get a good night's sleep.